Today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression. It has a huge impact on world history. It has a gigantic impact on literature, on art, on philosophy, on a variety of the topics we're concerned with in this course. And it does something huge in a way, promoting not only a certain vision of society, but also in suggesting that, much as the First World War did, previous ways of thinking about society, previous ways of thinking about values were incorrect. Now, there is one way, however, in which it actually counteracted the effects of the First World War. If the First World War led to a general loss of faith, the Depression made people get back to basics, realize that there were fundamental things that were difficulties that people faced, realize that there were much more important problems than the nature of artistic representation, or whether a urinal placed in an art show as an exhibit item in 1917 was truly art, and so forth. All of a sudden it focused the mind on real social problems, on real human problems, and on the importance of solving those. And so it was something that in a way reaffirmed norms, reaffirmed values, suggested, look, human life is important. There are certain things that really do matter. It had, as I mentioned, a huge impact on art. I'm not going to talk a lot about that in this lecture, but I do want to say a little bit about it. People did a lot of documentary work to try to represent what was going on in the Great Depression. We see stories now that are much more realistic portrayals. They're no longer so experimental concerning the nature of art. And the same thing happens with painting, with photography, with a variety of other things. All of a sudden people move from these questions of abstract form, from questions of perspectives all being represented at once, from representing dynamism and speed or surreal situations and so forth, to actually representing life. So here, for example, is a book that was very influential. Have you seen their faces? It consists of some text, but also photographs of subjects imprisoned on a sheet of film before they knew what had happened. And Bork White and others involved in this project ended up feeling somewhat guilty that they were there visiting the lives of people who were facing great difficulties and simply documenting them, not doing really anything directly to help them. Here is one of the photographs from that era. Here is another, somewhat ironic. A lot of these were done under the aegis of the Farm Security Administration, which undertook the project as part of the federal government of documenting conditions in the Great Depression. And so photographers were sent out all over the country to try to document what they saw. And they saw things, well, there are some of the photographers that were involved in this project, many people who became very famous. Stryker, Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Russell Lee, and so on. They did, well, yeah, let's get through that. Some of this was just documenting conditions on farms, but a lot of it was a matter of documenting conditions that people were facing during the Great Depression. Things like this. In some cases, segregation or other forms of injustice as well as economic difficulties. People living out of their car there in California. Here a family gathered around a table. These were scenes of ordinary life. They were meant to just represent what people faced day to day during the Depression. Some of them were happy. Some of them not so happy. But they give a picture taken together of what life in the United States in the 1930s was like. Here you see the setting for one of the most famous, probably the most famous photograph to come out of this era. Migrant mother. That's the really famous one. But it's part of a whole series. And it's something that came to symbolize the difficulties that the country was facing during that entire era. Let's take a look then at the broader circumstances of the Great Depression. It was something that involved unemployment, economic disaster on a scale before that scarcely even contemplated. Here you see bread lines, people lined up for food, for a chance to apply for jobs, and so forth. And there, that iconic photograph. This is what happened to the stock market in October 1929. A dramatic fall. The result, unemployment, soaring from around actually below 4%, to at the high point of the Depression, 25%. 1 out of 4 Americans who wanted a job was out of work. And you can see even by the end of the Great Depression there, it's barely under 15%. So this is something that was a difficulty not only because it was so severe, but because it lasted for so long. Things began to fall apart in October of 1929. The high point there is in 1932, but you can see that even by 1940, conditions remained terrible. Things got better as a result of a variety of things throughout the 1930s, but they still were terrible, even at their best point throughout the 1930s. Here is what happened with gross domestic product. You see that huge decline in the 1930s that only gradually we came out of. Now, how did all this happen? What were the causes of the Great Depression? And especially, people have investigated this not only for historical reasons, but to ask, how can we make sure it never happens again? Well, the first thing to point out is the beginning, the stock market crash in October of 1929. Now, the 1920s prosperity was real. There was a 45% increase in productivity. Mass manufacturing of things like automobiles, of clothing and so on, really did make the average person's life much better. Sometimes economic historians and others give you the impression that the prosperity of the 1920s was somehow fake, a fiction. It was all unraveled by the Great Depression. That's really unfair. There was a huge amount of economic growth, real productivity growth. People's lives really did get vastly better throughout what was known as, after all, the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, something that was a time of great prosperity. However, there were also real problems. There was a huge expansion in the money supply that took place during that decade. Now, some of that was appropriate enough due to increased economic activity, but it exceeded that. There was an especially large increase in 1928, and as we'll see in a moment, if you look at the graph of the stock market, you see a sudden uptick in 1928. Whenever the market is doing well, but then there's a very sudden upturn, be wary, because sometimes that means that money is being pumped into the system. Economic conditions can't improve that much that quickly. In any event, we had low interest rates. There were a variety of things, as we'll see, that led to serious problems. The economy had overheated by 1929. But there were other economic reasons. There were bad foreign loans, and we'll come back to that in a moment. In a way, the entire condition of international finance that had been set up after the First World War was unstable and was bound to fall apart. People began buying stocks on margin, which is to say they would borrow money to buy stocks. That's an extremely dangerous thing to do, and there are rules against doing that now, but it's something that a lot of people would do. They would put up $100 and buy $1,000 worth of stock with it, for example. Well, if the stock went up, that meant you could make phenomenal profits. Even a 10% gain was 100% improvement on your investment. But of course, if the stock went down 10%, you were out of your money entirely. So you were setting yourself up for extreme danger. And then finally, there were a lot of speculative funds that grew up with few real assets. People realized that the frenzy of investing in the stock market was so tremendous that everybody was investing in the stock market. In fact, one of the really wealthy people during that period announced that he had, fortunately, before the crash, gotten out of the market. Why? Because he walked into his office and found that his secretary and everyone else, even the clerks in the office, were talking about what stocks they had recently bought. And he thought, this is out of control. People don't know what they're doing. And in a lot of cases, they were buying worthless things that were being marketed that had no real assets behind them. Well, the crash then was probably needed to wipe out this excess of confidence, the excess in the money supply, these bursts of speculation. And after all, the crash itself in October 1929 wiped out only 1 year of gains, those dramatic gains, during 1928. Half of that was recovered within months. So this crash itself isn't a full explanation of what happened. You see that initial downturn, and it's serious, but on the other hand, it's not something that you might think it was impossible to recover from. However, if you look just before the area that I marked there, you see the downturn, then you see it coming back up. And so that initial crash wasn't so severe, it's what followed. Okay? So within a few months, by early 1930, it looked like things were recovering, and then the next 2 years were a disaster. And so it's really that next 2 years that has to be explained, not so much October 1929. Well, what are the causes of the Great Depression? How did that happen? What happened that kind of decline in the stock market? And by the way, I've lived long enough to have seen that kind of decline, or almost that severe a decline, several times during my life. In 1987, for example, again in 2007. I remember sitting around in the Cognitive Science Center here at UT in 1987 with a bunch of us, realizing we had just lost in one day 30% of our retirement funds. That was no fun. But anyway, things bounced back in both of those cases. In the first case, 1987, pretty quickly. 2007, more slowly. But in this case, there was an initial bounce back and then a much, much steeper decline. Well, there's no real consensus about the cause, and I tend to doubt that there was one cause. There were a bunch of contributing factors. There were a lot of policy decisions. Some of them were good, a lot of them were bad. And there's a lot of disagreement about which are which. There were different effects in different countries. Anyway, there are three main interpretations in economics of the causes of the Depression. The first one is the Keynesian model, put forward by that member of the Bloomsbury group we've talked about a little bit, John Maynard Keynes, a very famous economist. And he argued that this was a case of market failure. The Depression was really the result, he said, of insufficient demand. Government should spend to promote demand. This is called the multiplier effect. Basically, the thought is that if government spends money, that will actually increase economic activity. That money will go out to people who will then turn around and spend it. And so the effects of this will be multiplied throughout the economy. He argued for an activist role of government to a large extent, although his great work came out in 1936. As the Roosevelt administration was trying to solve these problems, you could describe the Roosevelt administration responses, and even the Hoover administration responses in many ways, as reflecting this underlying Keynesian view. A second interpretation is monetarism. It was put forward most powerfully by Anna Schwartz and Milton Friedman in An Economic History of the United States. And it basically says this was a case of Federal Reserve failure. That is to say, a disaster with respect to the money supply. The money supply had been allowed to increase too much, especially toward the end of the 1920s. But then there was an overreaction to that. It contracted much too much right around 1930. So in fact, if you look at the statistics as they did, it turns out there's a 30% decline in the overall money supply in the United States during that period, during just a 3-year period, basically 1929 to 1932. Well, during that time, there were additional policy mistakes. The Federal Reserve Bank allowed banks to fail. It raised interest rates instead of lowering interest rates. Ben Bernanke, who dealt with that 2007 crash, was an economic historian who studied this period, and in many ways you can see his response as Federal Reserve Chairman during the last decade as being an attempt to avoid the errors of the Fed during that period, to lower interest rates, for example, to increase the money supply through what was known as quantitative easing. In any case, the Fed in 1930 did exactly the opposite of that, restricted the money supply, raised interest rates, made economic conditions much more difficult. Neoclassical economists have a third economic explanation. That is to say, this is a case of government failure. Wages were kept as a matter of policy too high. Basically, when the money supply contracted, and that was a serious mistake, wages and prices should have allowed to fall together. If there's 30% less money in the economy, then it would make sense that prices and wages should just all fall by about 30%. And if that were to happen across the board, things wouldn't be so bad. But in fact, the government adopted policies to try to keep wages high. Why? Well, they didn't really want people to feel bad about losing money and making less money. But the result of that is that, well, there was huge unemployment. Keep wages high, but lower the amount of money in the economy. It means fewer people will be working. The ones who are working will be in great shape. The ones who aren't working will be in terrible trouble. Also, insofar as the government took on a larger role and spent money, raised taxes and so forth, the argument here goes that government tends to spend money less efficiently than private people do. So when the government actually takes over and spends in these kinds of circumstances, it tends to lower efficiency. You and I would do a better job of spending our money on things that matter. The government is likely to know far less than we do, and so to make mistakes. So the thought is, there's not a positive multiplier as the Keynesians think, there's actually a negative effect. Insofar as government raises taxes, spends more money, it's actually distorting the economy in a way that makes adjustment more difficult and makes the depression longer lasting. In any case, there are a lot of videos and other resources for investigating this further if you're interested in economic questions underlying this. I put some of them here. A lot of those are really helpful and really informative. The first is also really fun, Fear the Boom and Bust. It's a Hayek versus Keynes music video done by two economists, but it's really, really well done. It was done very professionally in a studio. And actually, there's a funny story about this. One of the economists who did this came home that night and was talking to his kids and said, oh yeah, and I was there in the studio and it was really a very fancy production. And there was somebody waiting to use the studio after us to make a music video. It was such a nice girl. And so we talked, as we were coming out of the studio and she was going in. So the kids were like, well, who was the singer? Anybody I've heard of? Oh, I don't know. She had a funny name. Kesha. And the kids were like, what? You met Kesha? Oh yeah, we talked for like 15 minutes while they were setting things up. Anyway, moment of fame for those economists. But this is, well, if we have time at the end, I'll try to talk fast. And if we have time at the end, I'll come back and show you some of that, because it really is awesome. But for now, I want to make sure we actually get through what we're supposed to get through. So I'll give you that incentive not to ask many questions or raise many objections. Now, many people blame the Depression on Herbert Hoover, and that isn't entirely unjust. There was a huge contraction in the money supply. The president was not in charge of that, the Federal Reserve was, but Hoover himself certainly did nothing to stop it. The money supply fell by a third between August of 1929 and March 1933. That's really a shocking decline. That's a huge jolt on an economy. It would have been very difficult for anyone to recover from that. Hoover, moreover, was not like Calvin Coolidge. He was himself a progressive in the mold of Wilson. And so he was somebody who responded in a way that turned out to be pretty unhelpful as a response to that particular problem. Why do I say that? Well, here is what he did. He was the one, mostly, who worked to keep wages and prices high. He was concerned that there would be a serious psychological effect if people found their wages falling. Everybody likes to get a raise. And so, being a philosophy professor, big raises are very few and far between. But, typically what happens is somebody gets, a cost of living increase of 1% or 2% or 3%, blah, 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 blah. Keeps you feeling good. Occasionally you get a promotion, occasionally you get a bigger raise than that. But that has good psychological effects. What if you were told suddenly by your employer, listen, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I'm cutting your salary by 1/3. People would hate it, right? And Hoover thought that would make him very unpopular. It would also make the country very discouraged. So he worked to keep wages high and also to keep prices high. He didn't want people to cut prices because he thought then that the people selling these things would be in economic trouble. So he instituted a variety of policies to keep wages and prices high. But of course, the result of that was, given lots of a decrease in the money supply, it meant there was less money to go around. So inevitably, fewer people were capable of buying goods, fewer people had jobs. He also raised taxes. The top tax rate went from 25% under Coolidge to, by 1932, 63%. Remember that Wilson had raised taxes dramatically during the First World War. Here, Hoover did it, but in response to these economic conditions. Well, what that did is draw a huge amount of money, also out of the private economy. So not only was the money supply hit by a third, but now taxes went up, which was something that took money out of people's hands as well. The estate tax doubled. There was a corporate income tax established for the first time of almost 14%. Today it's 35%, by the way. He also instituted a tax on every check, which taxed economic activity, which meant there was less economic activity. So every one of those moves was something that actually all economists today would look at and say, yeah, those are all moves that you do maybe when an economy is overheating. They're things that slow economic activity, and that's something that even then Keynesians and classical economists and the monetarists would have agreed upon. Anyway, maybe the worst of all, the kick that affected the entire world as opposed to the United States, was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. That was something that had a devastating effect on international trade. 1,028 economists signed a letter to Hoover warning that its effects would be disastrous. They begged him not to sign it. Thomas Lamont, a partner at J.P. Morgan, said in June of 1930, "I almost went down on my knees to beg Herbert Hoover to veto the asinine Hawley-Smoot tariff. That act intensified nationalism all over the world. It was something that, as we'll see, had a huge impact on Germany and helped to lead to the rise of Adolf Hitler. In that way, it was something that had a crucial role to play in setting up the conditions that led to the Second World War." Here you see the New York Times cover when that happened. 1,028 economists asked Hoover to veto pending tariff bill. He did not. It's fascinating to see the other things. Woman leads fight on laundry gangs and terrorism. Well, that brings us to the economic conditions internationally. And I mentioned earlier that in a sense the result of the First World War was to set up a highly unstable system. Here's how that happened. There were massive war debts imposed on Germany and the other losing countries by the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson's idea was initially that people should forgive and forget and try to put all of this behind them. That view did not prevail. Instead, Britain and France insisted on reparations from Germany. It was a huge amount of money. The United States and the United Kingdom refused to forgive war debts, but they did float countries large loans. And so what happened with the Smoot-Hawley tariff is that trade was restricted and heavily taxed in effect, and it shut down the only way those loans could be repaid. The result was a series of government defaults, countries actually declaring bankruptcy. First, take a look at what happened to international trade. It declined dramatically after the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Here you see it in the form of a spiral graph spinning down the plug hole, as it says here. Here's another representation. You see Black Thursday, the 24th of October 1929, that was the crash. Then you see a decline. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed in June 1930. Initially, it didn't have much of an effect, but very shortly thereafter, it led to a further decline. And over the next 2 years, international trade plummeted to only about 20% or 30% of what it had been before. Here's another graph that shows you that in a more dramatic form. So here are the countries that ended up declaring bankruptcy, sovereign defaults on their debts. Initially in 1931, the sort of first cards to collapse: Hungary, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Peru, El Salvador, Ecuador. Then the next year, Germany, Bulgaria, Colombia, Panama, Nicaragua, Paraguay. Notice, virtually all of Central and South America was in deep trouble as a result of this. But the big one to note there is Germany, simply because that was part of what led to the rise of Hitler. German unemployment soared to 45%, and that had a huge impact on people's willingness to elect a Nazi. Then the next year, Romania, Yugoslavia, Cuba, Guatemala, Uruguay. Then Poland, then Italy, and Turkey. This contagion spread throughout the globe. In the United States, the result was that unemployment rose from 4% to 25%. And it stayed over 20% for several years. It only got down below it around 1935 in the middle of the decade. And even by the end of the decade, it was still over 15%. Leading to massive lines like this of people waiting to apply for jobs. The 1932 election results are maybe in this condition unsurprising. Hoover was rejected overwhelmingly, and the Democratic candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, won a resounding victory. As you can see, only Pennsylvania, Delaware, and parts of New England ended up going for Hoover. Roosevelt declared right from the outset that he had a different philosophy of government, a different kind of response. In some ways, the economic policies were not that different from Hoover's. In other ways, they were dramatically different. But the underlying philosophical view certainly was something that involved an entire new conception of government. He said, our task now is not discovery or exploitation of natural resources, or necessarily producing more goods. It's the sober or less dramatic business of administering resources already at hand, of distributing wealth and products more equitably, of adapting existing economic organizations to the service of the people. The day of enlightened administration has come. So his goal is partly to use the government to redistribute income more equitably. That's something that no previous president had really thought of as an important economic goal and a role of government. And secondly, of actually having an enlightened administration. This is in a way an expansion of Wilson's idea that we should have an administrative state consisting of experts who are capable of guiding the economy and leading public life in various other ways. As I see it, he said, the task of government is to assist the development of an economic declaration of rights. Now, what does he mean by an economic declaration of rights? He means that among the rights of people should be not simply, as it's sometimes called, negative rights or general rights, rights to freedom from various kinds of interference, as the right to life, liberty, and property, for example, is normally considered. That is to say, I have a right to life. What does that mean? You can't kill me, okay? I don't mean, you cannot kill me. I mean, it would be immoral, it would be unjust for you to kill me. I have a right to liberty. It would be unjust for you to enslave me, or imprison me, or kidnap me. What about my right to property? It would be unjust for you to steal from me. Those are all ways of saying I have a right to be free from interference by others. But he's talking here about a different kind of right. A minimum requirement of a more permanently safe order of things. So he says, every man has a right to life. But notice his conception now is going far beyond that non-interference conception to something that philosophers sometimes call a positive right. This means he has a right to make a comfortable living. He might not make use of that right, but the right itself cannot be denied. So the idea is everyone has a right to life. That doesn't just mean it would be unjust to kill you. Other people may not interfere with your continued living. It means that you have a right to the things that would be supportive of a life. You have a right to housing. You have a right to medical care. You have a right to a job. You have a right to make a living. Now, these are things that pertain in some ways to outcomes. That is to say, other people have to provide certain things for you. So, he says, one of these duties of the state is that of caring for its citizens who cannot care for themselves, who are victims of adverse circumstances. And so the idea is that people who need help now should be helped, not simply as a matter of charity, but as a matter of social justice. This is the role of government, not merely the role of churches or other private individuals. So he says, to these unfortunate citizens, aid must be extended by governments, not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of social duty. People are entitled to opportunities for jobs, to opportunities for health care, to opportunities for housing, and so on and so forth. So he says, no one should go unfed, unclothed, or unsheltered. A right to shelter, a right to clothing, a right to food, a right to a job, and so on. These are duties, not just duties of Christian charity, for example, but duties of social justice. So, well, I've already mentioned some examples. Notice something important about these substantive positive rights. Other people have to do something for you. That is to say, it's not saying, don't interfere with me. You may not kidnap me. You may not murder me. You may not enslave me. This is saying, no, other people have to enable you to have housing, have to enable you to have a job, have to enable you to have health care, and so on. It's not enough for other people not to interfere. They have to actually do positive things. Now, even in the original conception of the Constitution, there are some positive rights like this. The right to a jury trial is like this. It's not, the right to a jury trial doesn't mean, hey, we won't interfere with your ability to put together a jury if you want to. It's actually saying that will be provided for you. And so these are rights like this, but unlike the right to a jury trial, which is a matter of legal procedure, these are matters of substance. This is saying, no, it's not just a process that we owe you, it's something more than a process. It is something that is actually a substantive good. Well, corresponding to that change in the conception of government spending increased significantly throughout the 1930s. So there really was a new social contract, if you want to think of it this way, a new relationship that arose between the federal government and the population. And you see that increase here from 1930 to 1940. It's almost a doubling. But to put that in historical perspective, we can go to a wider range. Here it is 1920 to 1940. So you see the more dramatic change from, say, 1922 to that time, where it's well over a doubling. Here you see it from the period 1900 to 1940. And so you see that federal spending was really at an extraordinarily low level before 1900. And then even in the first decade of the 20th century, it was very low. Most people never had any contact with the federal government. There was a dramatic increase with the First World War, but then after the war, things went, well, not down to the level they had been before Wilson, but nevertheless went down significantly. However, they rose gradually throughout the 1920s, even given the governing philosophy of Harding and then Coolidge, and then took a much more dramatic increase during the Depression under Roosevelt. People talk a lot about the New Deal, but actually the New Deal was two separate deals. There was the first New Deal and the second New Deal in Roosevelt's first and second administrations. And it's important to keep them distinct because different attitudes were involved, different acts. The first New Deal was in many ways wiped out by Supreme Court decisions. The second New Deal persists with us today. So it's important to draw the distinction. There was a vast increase in the size and conception of government's role during the first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration. And by the way, you will still see whenever we have a new president, people focusing on the first 100 days, saying what's been accomplished in the first 100 days. Why 100 days? All of that comes from Roosevelt, who took office in 1933 and had a conscious and stated effort to try to implement things that would cure the Great Depression in the first 100 days. Here were some of the things that were done. The Emergency Banking Act, which tried to, well, it declared a bank holiday, but tried to bail out banks. There was an abandonment of the gold standard. It became illegal for private citizens to own gold at that time. I remember my grandfather showing me a gold coin. I guess it was a $10 gold coin from before the Depression. He had hidden it in a drawer, and he was very proud of the fact that the government confiscated all gold, but not that. He had kept one gold coin. I have no idea where that is now, but it must be worth a lot of money now. Anyway, the Economy Act, now this is interesting. No contemporary politician, I think, would have the guts even to propose this. Cutting government employee salaries and veterans benefits by 40%. Then, this was not entirely his doing, but there was, coinciding with Roosevelt's taking office, the repeal of prohibition. That did a huge amount to cheer up the country. All of a sudden, you might not have a job, but at least you could get drunk.
Nice.
By the way, I don't mean that in an entirely flippant sense. This was a huge deal to people. It was widely celebrated. It did improve the national mood considerably. I have a photograph in my office of a bunch of trucks, beer trucks, lined up outside the Texas State Capitol. What's that photograph about? They were ready for the repeal of prohibition to go into effect. It went into effect on noon on a given day. All the beer trucks were lined up outside the Capitol building so that they could rush in and serve the legislators beer the first moment it was legal. And presumably that was a big, big deal in 1933. Now, might still be, I don't know. Prohibition ends at last. You can see the level of enthusiasm people had for that. Other things. The Agricultural Adjustment Act is one of the acts that I think was the most damaging and kept conditions bad in much of the country for much longer than intended. Roosevelt and his cabinet admitted later that they had no idea what they were doing. They were throwing up ideas on the wall, seeing what stuck, trying various things out, seeing what worked. One of them, who was in charge of economic policy, said, look, we weren't really Keynesians or monetarists or classical economists or anything. We had no theory. We were just stuck with a problem and we were just trying out solutions. This one kept food prices high. The idea was to make things better for farmers by keeping food prices high to keep farmers in business. But it did that by taking a lot of land out of production. People were ordered by the government to plow under their crops. They were to slaughter pigs and simply bury them rather than selling them on the market. The result of that was that food prices did stay high, but also it produced widespread hunger, especially in the cities. And so it ended up being very unpopular. It was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1936, and it was not that close a decision, 6-3. There were also jobs and infrastructure programs, things like the WPA, the PWA, the CCC, the REA, the TVA, and if you don't know what those stand for, That's a sign that you're young. I'm old enough to remember what those stand for. Sorry?
My grandfather worked for one of those.
Ah, okay, good. Your grandfather worked for one of those. Yeah, a lot of people ended up working for these, at least temporarily. They were attempts to give people jobs, and they resulted in a lot of public projects that are with us today. A lot of you would have visited one of them, I'm sure. The Riverwalk in San Antonio was built by these programs. And so a lot of national parks were at this point developed, and people would go into the national parks and clear the national parks. A lot of the trails you find in national parks were actually created by these groups during the 1930s, especially the CCC. A lot of the South was electrified due to the REA, including areas of central Texas. In fact, that's how Lyndon Baines Johnson became a political force. He was the person who helped bring electricity to central Texas. In any case, this was struck down in 1936. Well, not all of that, but the Agricultural Adjustment Act was, as beyond the power of the federal government. Partly it was a matter of the federal government taking over state power, partly it was a matter of regulation, in this case simply being coercion. And here the crucial point is, look, a central government cannot exercise uncontrolled police power even if it thinks that there's an emergency that requires it. There were other aspects of the first 100 days. Two planning boards, the National Industrial Recovery Act established the National Planning Board that set prices and quotas for production in all sorts of industries, and the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, but not that NRA, established a minimum wage, put limits on working hours and conditions, negotiated with industry. The result of that was a drop of 25% in industrial production. It raised costs 40%. That was the original symbol of the NRA, that NRA, that is to say this National Recovery Administration. And these were struck down unanimously by the Supreme Court in 1935. Extraordinary conditions do not create or enlarge constitutional power. The case involved a Brooklyn poultry company that allowed you to pick out your own chicken. There would be chickens there, and you could say, I want that one. And that was in violation of the rules of the NRA and the NIRA. This court said basically you can't let people pick out their own chickens. And Schlechter said that's ridiculous and ended up winning unanimously. Ah, yes. You cannot transcend the constitutional limits on government power just because you think that's necessary to respond to what you see as an emergency. So some parts of the first New Deal survived. Many parts of it, however, were struck down by the courts. The second New Deal was different. The second New Deal involved a new set of policies. One of them, still with us today, is the Social Security Administration. The idea here was to give people a sort of pension in old age, regardless of economic conditions, something that could be relied upon, no matter whether the economy was booming or busting. There were also tax increases in 1934, 1935, 1936. The top rate went back up to 79%, where it had been at the height of the First World War. The National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, still in effect, dramatically tipped the balance of power between labor and management in favor of labor and helped to empower unions. The Social Security Act, I've already mentioned. There were extensive regulations throughout the economy designed to try to distribute things equitably, to institute the kind of planning that before had been done by the NIRA and the NRA. All of those policies were economically damaging as well. The economy had recovered by the mid-1930s to some extent. Unemployment was back down to around 15%, but it increased again, and there was a recession of 1937-1938, partly because of these tax increases. There you see, in fact, the history of the top tax rate since the creation of the income tax. And you can see the high point that it reached during the First World War with the first peak there. Then that second peak was under Roosevelt as part of the New Deal. It stayed that way, as you can see, until, well, the Kennedy tax cuts around 1960, and then the further Reagan tax cuts in the early 1980s. And then the tax reform that was bipartisan in the late 80s, but since then it's gone back up somewhat. In any event, there was a dramatic change in tax policy between the policies that had been instituted during the 1920s under Harding and Coolidge and then those under Hoover and Roosevelt. Roosevelt became increasingly frustrated that the Supreme Court was overturning the things he was trying to do in the New Deal, striking down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Recovery Act, and so on. And so he decided that he would pack the Supreme Court, expanding it from 9 justices to 15, allowing him to make 6 new appointments of people who would support the New Deal. This was actually widely unpopular. People on both sides of the aisle thought that this was an outrageous abrogation of presidential power and something that disrupted the balance of power between the branches of government. So it didn't go anywhere. However, it did have a significant impact in the following way. One Supreme Court justice decided to reverse his position on these questions about the constitutionality of New Deal regulation. And that was enough to change the balance of power on the court from a majority opposing these regulations to one supporting them. This was referred to in the history of the Supreme Court as the switch in time that saved 9. That's supposed to be clever. That's a law professor's idea of a clever joke. Anyhow, I'm not a law professor. I'm not saying it's that clever or that funny, but you take what you can get when you're studying constitutional law. Now, the first dramatic case that was affected by this was West Coast Hotel versus Parish, 1937. It was a case that approved a minimum wage for women. Up to that time, the court had struck down minimum wage laws as unconstitutional, as violations of the liberty of contract between an employer and an employee. Basically, they said people have a right to liberty, it's enshrined in the Constitution, other people may not tell you what kinds of agreements you may enter into. However, at this point, the court decided you can, actually, because of the difficult economic conditions and because of the huge imbalance of power between employers and employees. So, and by the way, part of this decision is highly sexist from our contemporary point of view. It's like, well, we surely wouldn't approve this for men who can negotiate on their own, but for women, they're too weak-minded to do it on their own, so we'll approve it for women. A lot of these key decisions in the 1930s, when you read them, part of the arguments survive well. Like the difference in balance of power between an employee and an employer, that's plausible. The idea that women are too weak-minded to negotiate, that's, I hope, less plausible. Anyway, some parts of this will shock you if you actually read these decisions. Other parts you might well approve. Another case the next year, U.S. versus Caroline Products Corporation. It ended what is known as the Lochner era in the history of the Supreme Court, and it drew a distinction between civic and economic liberties, one that has been fundamental to liberalism ever since. The court here said, we adopt 2 different standards with respect to civil liberties and with respect to economic liberties. The Lochner court treated economic liberties and civil liberties as if they were the same sort of thing, and they had to have the same kind of protection. We've decided that economic liberties are in a different category. They deserve less protection. And so this case is famous for another reason. It ended up using the locution in a footnote of discrete and insular minorities that was later to become crucial in the history of the Supreme Court in the 1950s and 60s. But in any case, it was something that allowed a wide range of economic regulation. In this case, the banning of a product known as milnut. And then later, 1942, Wickard versus Filburn, the extension of this series of cases, a farmer growing wheat that he ate on his own farm was judged to be in violation of these acts concerning agriculture. He was growing wheat over his quota. He didn't sell that wheat over his quota, he simply ate it on his own farm. But that, it was judged, would have an effect on economic activity, and so counted as interstate commerce, even though the wheat never left his own farm. That really opened the door to the federal government regulating any economic activity. So, here is part of the decision in West Coast Hotel versus Parish. Liberty in a social organization requires the protection of law against the evils which menace the health, safety, morals, and welfare of the people. And the Constitution permits regulation that's reasonable in relation to its subject and adopted in the interests of the community. So this was really a way of saying, look, government should be protecting the health, safety, morals, and welfare of the people, and it may regulate economic activity to that end. It may, in particular, protect people against exploitation. In that U.S. versus Caroline Products case, the court said the existence of fact supporting a legislative judgment is to be presumed, the assumption is that it rests on some rational basis. So as long as there's a rational basis for the regulation, it's acceptable. In fact, and this part's sort of funny, there's now an extensive literature indicating wide recognition by scientists and dietitians of the great importance to the public health of butterfat and whole milk. This product involved basically taking the fat out of milk, turning it into skim milk, but then putting in a little coconut oil so that it had a richer texture. And people often used it in baking because it was so much cheaper than ordinary milk. I remember seeing it on my grandmother's shelf, for example. And basically the thought was, what? You mean no butter? Drinking skim milk? Oh my God, that's unhealthy. We all know that's unhealthy. That's the part that's funny in that one. Anyway, there's the product. It did remain on sale in certain states. It was really just the interstate commerce in this that was restricted. But all of that was extended in Wickard versus Filburn. Even if it's not actually engaged in commerce at all, and even if it doesn't cross state lines, it still has an effect on interstate commerce.